Today, we are on our way back to Minmus with the contract Build a New Surface Outpost on Minmus. I will not only be looking at building a base that meets the contract requirements, but also something that will be easy to expand upon in future missions. Of course, the best base in the world isn't any good if you can't get it where it needs to go. I will show you how to build a simple sky crane to place the station on the surface, as well as how to build a vehicle to carry such an awkwardly shaped payload. Let's get started. And we'll start this off by taking a look at the contract, build a new surface outpost on Minmus, and going over the objectives here. Build a new outpost that has an antenna, has docking port, and generate power. So this is pretty common on all of the bases and station contracts. So just make sure you always have that covered. The outpost needs to be fully assembled when launched. It must have the facility to support at least 5 kerbals. Note the word supporting here. It just needs to be able to support them. In other words, have seats for them. You don't physically have to have 5 kerbals there, and we're going to be taking advantage of that. Have a viewing cupola on the outpost, so that's a specific part. Needs to have maintain stability for 10 seconds. In other words, it's not rolling down a hill. And land your outpost anywhere you want on Minmus. And here's our payouts in terms of cash and reputation. I have one more contract I'm also going to fulfill at the same time. Up here I got Explore Minmus, and the objective is to get a stable orbit of Minmus. Always put myself into a stable orbit before I do a landing, so this one will come along in the natural course of doing the mission, so we might as well grab that as well. And taking a look at the tech tree, you have to have pretty much the first 5 tiers unlocked. I don't have aerodynamics done yet. I just haven't bothered. I won't be using any parts from that, but pretty much these 5 tiers you have to have. You can also see that I also have heavier rocketry, precision propulsion, specialized construction, command modules, which is the one that has the cupola module, so you definitely have to have that one, and precision engineering. Make sure you have those as well. And in fact, I'm going to unlock 3 more nodes to help me out here. We're going to go down here to Advanced Electrics. Advanced Electrics gives us deployable solar panels and some bigger batteries. Going to grab that up. We're going to look at Advanced Exploration right here. Advanced Exploration ladder is really what I'm looking for here. It's ridiculous that this is as far down the tech tree as it is, but lots of other great parts. I'm really going to be taking advantage of this big storage module. I like the EVA fuel cylinders for exploring Minmus. They're perfect. We're going to grab that one. And we're also going to grab field science. This isn't technically necessary for the build, but you'll see where I'm using these little rover parts very, very shortly. Also, I'm going to upgrade mission control. Not critical for this one, but if I advance this to level 3, the final level for all of the buildings, I will have unlimited contracts, not that much money, certainly a very early worthwhile upgrade. But with that, let's get started. We're going to start by going into the space plane hangar. I always like building my stations and my bases in the space plane hangar because you get this nice ability to move laterally much more easier than you do in the vehicle assembly building, which is designed to go vertically. We're obviously not going to launch to the runway. We'll take what we build over to the vehicle assembly building to get it to Minmus, but we're going to start the build here. So let's take a look at our contract and make sure we got everything covered that we need. There we go. So we must have, well, let's get started with the cupola module. There it is right there. Let's turn it so that it is that way. There we go. So that is our cupola module. It's fairly heavy, can hold 1 kerbal, but it's got a nice view. It's really what this is all about. We're going to plunk this right there on the top, and to give us our required 5 kerbals, well, I also have unlocked the hitchhiker cam. We're just going to plunk that right underneath. There we go. And the hitchhiker can hold up to 4 kerbals and have lots of inventory slots. So there we go. We got our 5 kerbals requirement there. We have our cupola module required there. We also must have docking ports, generate power, and have an antenna. So let's get those kind of things covered up. Antennas from Minmus, really just a Communitron 16 is going to be fine. I'm going to go with 2 of them because Oh, why not? That looks okay, so that's got that part covered. And then finally, docking ports. Now, to be honest, all I got to do, there is a node on top here that you can plunk it there. I hate that. I don't want to cover up that window. But you can also just stick it over here on the side somewhere. So you could just do that. And I mean, that has that part. And to be honest, this would be a very serviceable module for a base. And it's also something that's going to be relatively easy to launch. But for instructive purposes, I actually want to build something that's a little bit more awkward to get into orbit and show people that you can launch really awkwardly shaped craft. So what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to go over to structure, and I want to put on a couple of these structural fuselages really kind of sticking out sideways like that. Now, you can see how they are a little bit awkward. These are going to be like transportation tubes that our Kerbals can travel along to get to other bases that we will add at a later date. But you can see they're kind of awkward. Now, there's a couple of ways to fix them. Number one is, don't forget the ever useful cubic octagonal struts. These are great. They can be attached radially anywhere, and they basically provide a node. And if I rotate this the right way, that can now stick on the side, and then you can use the translation tool. If I zoom in here, click on the actual part there itself, and if I take the snap off, you can slide them in until they don't look so funny. And then part's hidden. It's very, very light, only 1 kilogram, and you can see, now if you like that aesthetically, that can work perfectly fine for you. I'm not going to do that actually. I'm going to use instead, even though it's a little bit heavier, but only because I like the shape better, is I am going to use these radial attachment points, and I'm going to center them right on the window. So it's centered in there, and then these can go on the end. And I don't know, I like that. Looks a little better in my mind anyway. And then I'm just going to take the docking ports and take these regular docking ports, and we're going to flip them around and stick them on the end. So we got one on each end. And then in the future, if I wanted to, I can expand upon this with further modules like a science lab or drilling platforms or anything like that. And finally, one last requirement here is for it to be able to generate power. So I'm going to go over to electricity, and we're going to grab the AUX-4W 3x2 photovoltaic panels, and we're going to stick just a couple of them right here on the side. You can extend those out like that. That will provide ample power for our station. By the way, the difference between these guys, which are a little bit lighter, and these guys, here I'll grab the equivalent one, the SP-Ws, and if you extend them, they look the same, they generate the exact same amount of power. The difference is that these ones are retractable. I can retract all of them in the VAB, but these guys here, if I'm in flight, cannot be retracted. So once I extend them, they're extended forever. These guys here can be retracted and extended as many times as you like, and the cost of that is they're a little bit heavier. Once these are extended though, I think I'm done with them, so I'm perfectly cool with just the lighter ones here, and they will generate enough power. Now, speaking about power, we should be thinking about electricity storage. This thing needs to survive a Minmus night, and a Minmus night is about 6 hours long. So we would like to have enough electrical storage for it to survive the 6 hours, for it to not run out of electricity. Now, to be honest, when the vessel is not rendered, the game does not model electrical usage. So you can, if you're not with the vessel, it actually doesn't matter whether you have enough batteries or not. However, I like to provide the required amount of batteries anyways. It's not that hard to do. So let's put on some stuff that uses up power. Right now, there's not a lot of power being used, so I'm going to stick on some lights. So we're going to go over to utility here. We have all kinds of lights we can add on. There are the Illuminator Mark 1s and the Illuminator Mark 2s. These are your brightest lights. They are different. They're more than just the shape. If you look, the Mark 1s use up 2.4 units of electric charge per minute, while the Mark 2s use up 1.2 units of electric charge per minute, half as much. These guys aren't quite as bright. I think they're going to do fine, so I'm going to put on, let's get off the mirror symmetry here. We're going to put on 4 of these like so. Yeah, about there. We'll texture these white so they kind of blend in a little better. Okay, those look great. And we'll also add on, I'll turn these ones off. I'm going to add on a couple of these dome lights here. We're going to put them right here. Let's put the snap back on. And the purpose of these lights are simply to light up these tubes and perhaps potentially anything that's attached to them. Alright, so let's add up how much electricity that comes out to. So the Mark II illuminators are 1.2 units of electric charge per minute. I have 4 of them, so that's 4.8 units of electric charge. And the dome lights are less. They're only 0.3 units of electric charge. I have 2 of them, so that adds on another 0.6. So that is 5.4 units of electric charge per minute. As mentioned, a Minmus night is about 6 hours. So we take 5.4, we multiply that by 60, and that's how much we got per hour, and then we multiply by 6 to get a total of, these guys would use up about 1,944 units of electric charge over the night. So I would like to have that amount of battery storage, and I can cover that fairly easily with these guys, these Z400s that I just unlocked. They each have 400 units of electric charge. I'm going to put on 6 of them. That gets me 2,400 units of electric charge being stored. There we are, looking good, looking good. Okay, what are we on to next? Well, I want to put a bunch of storage on this. There's actually a lot of storage in the Hitchhiker, but I want to put on more because once I get Kerbals down here, which is going to be in a future episode, I really want to play with the construction tools and show you how they all work. So if I go over here to my cargo section, I have a lot of cargo containers. We've talked about these guys, which it's the volume limits that you'll run into first before you run into the inventory slots quite often. 60 liters of volume, 180 liters of volume on this one, but if we take a look here, we have the SEQ-9, which is a 1.25 meter part, 650 units or liters of volume, and the SEQ-24, a 2.5 meter part, 2,500 liters of storage and 24 additional storage slots. We're going to stick that right here on the bottom. And then we're going to put on some landing struts, and of course we are going to put on a ladder. The Kellis Mobility Enhancer will do us just fine, just need a single one. This way our Kerbals don't have to jump. There is a little arrow here telling you which way the ladder is going to extend. You can see this one is not the right way around, so we're going to flip it around like that and extend the ladder, and it reaches close enough down to the surface. Now, one thing with ladders, you always want to test them out. It's really easy for the Kerbal to get kind of stuck in there and without it being obvious that that's going to do. So we're going to put a Kerbal. Oh, Jebediah has already grabbed the seat. We're going to launch this thing, and we're just going to make sure that Jebediah can get out. Get right down there. As you get past, there we go. See, everything is good. Yep, and that he can get back up again. Revert our flight back to the spaceplane hangar. We're going to continue our build. And we got all of this cargo space, and clearly that's there with purpose, so let's put in that cargo. But the purpose of all of this cargo isn't going to be apparent until we crew the station, and that's going to be for a future episode. But what I'll do is I'll put a complete list of the cargo off to the side so that people that are following along with the build can follow along with this part of it as well. But with that taken care of, what a lot of people are noticing is that all fine and good, but how the heck are you going to be landing this thing? So we're going to build this a sky crane. I really like the sky crane idea for landing things that aren't meant to take off once again, because once you've landed, you can then ditch the sky crane. So sky crane is just some sort of rocket device that fits on the top that you can detach once it has done its job, and it can fly off and then crash somewhere else, and this is going to be left just sitting on the surface. So let's talk a little bit about the budget for the landing. If we take a look here at the Delta V map, we can see that a landing, according to this map, is 180 meters per second of Delta V. Like all of the powered landings on these maps, I find these really tight, and so for the purposes of this tutorial, I'm going to add on 50% to give you lots of Delta V to be able to land this thing. So we're going to budget 270 meters per second for our landing. So we're going to start off with going over to here to coupling, and I'm going to use the TD-12 Decoupler, and we're going to put that right on the top. Now it's really important, let's get this on here. when you put it on that this is on upside down. We don't want to leave the decoupler attached to the top of our base. So if you take a look at the little triangle, it points to what's going to be detached. The base of the triangle, it's going to remain attached to. So this one's upside down. Make sure yours is too. And then on the top of that, we're going to put on a 1.25 meter service bay. Just like that, so we can put some stuff inside. And inside of that, we're going to put in a hex probe core, because we're going to need to be able to control this thing. Now, especially in the spaceplane hangar, really make sure that this is in right side up. And you can tell by taking a look at the word hex. If it's right side up, then the probe is right side up. If you don't do that, your nav ball will be upside down. Not fun. So make sure that that is right side up. And then we're going to add a Z200 battery and a single Communitron 16, because this thing is going to have to fly autonomously briefly after it detaches from the base. And now what we got to do is put on some rockets. Now you want these rocket engines to extend past the base. If the exhaust from the rocket engine is actually pushing down on top of any kind of structure here, that will affect the propulsion and can dramatically reduce the amount of propulsion you have. You do not want that to happen. So we want to extend our rocket engines out past this structure. So what I'm going to do is under structure, I'm going to grab a couple of octagonal struts. We're going to stick them right here on the side. There we go. So we got one there on the other side. And the fuel we're going to need is just a single pair of Oscar B fuel cans. And then I'm going to go back to our struts. And we're just going to put on another pair like that. Again, the purpose is just to get those engines out past the structure here. And speaking of engines, we're going to use 4 of these 24-77 Twitch liquid fuel engines. They're a radial engine, and they are going to do our purposes here perfectly. There we go. That should do it. And again, the nozzles are far enough out. If you aren't sure, just put on another octagonal strut, but I've already tested this and I know that it works out perfectly fine. And we'll go over to here. We'll put all 4 engines on at the same time, because they're definitely going to want to do that. And if we put this on vacuum, you can see we have 201 meters per second of delta V. I would like more. Remember, I'm shooting for over 270. Thrust to weight ratio, though, of 1.11. That's on Kerbal. That's great. If I switch it over to Minmus, actually, you'll see, if I switch this to Minmus, thrust to weight is through the roof. I don't need nearly this much thrust. But for me personally, I find landing with, even if I don't technically need that much thrust, I like landing with a thrust to weight ratio of about 1. It just gives me a lander that I'm used to how it's going to perform, instead of having to deal with every landing separately. More thrust during a powered landing is never a bad thing, but I do need more fuel. So we're going to go back up here to fuel cans. I'm going to grab a pair of these R-4 dumpling external fuel tanks, and we're going to stick them right here on the top. Wonderful. And that puts us up to 304 meters per second of vacuum delta V, which is plenty. This thing we're sitting in orbit about Minmus, it would be able to get itself down to the surface. That brings us to our next part. We need to get this thing in orbit about Minmus. So in order to do that, we're going to switch over to the VAB, and we're going to make a rocket for this thing. And again, remember, I intentionally wanted this to be an awkward shape to make this something that is a little more challenging to get into orbit. So we're gonna, we'll bring this up. Let's see, bring this up like this, and we're going to turn it that way. I want it to be like this. This is the orientation in which it's going to go up, because this is the widest part between these 2 docking ports. I want the part vertical on our rocket so that we have a chance to get a fairing around this thing. So speaking of getting this fairing around this thing, let's add some stuff. We're just going to attach straight onto this docking port. So because the hex probe that is in here is now going sideways, I don't want to fly by that the whole way. So I'm actually going to put in another hex probe right underneath this docking port right here, and we're going to make this now the root part, so that now this will be the default control thing, which is pointing vertical, which is what we want. And I'm also going to put on a nice big set of reaction wheels like that. but to help us with our control. And now we're going to put on our fairing. So we're going to take our fairing here, going into payload, 2.5 meter fairing, which is the biggest one I got. I'm going to slide that right under here. We're not going to build the fairing just yet. Now, it's really important because underneath this, of course, we're going to end up building our rocket below that, and we want the thrust from that engine going up through the center of mass, and we can deal with this right now by putting on our center of mass overlay, and we can see our center of mass is up here towards the side. And then what I want to do is I want to use the move tool, make sure this is on, the snap is off, and I'm going to slide this way so that this center arrow, this arrow is right at the center of this fairing, is pointing straight up towards the center of mass as best we can. And that's looking maybe a little bit this way. I think that's looking pretty close, and with those reaction wheels pretty close will be good enough. So let's build the fairing, and for people that don't like huge fairings, I'm advising you to close your eyes right now. We're going to put this on clamshell deploy, 6 sides, really jack up the force. Okay, and we're also going to, because it's only connected by this flimsy little docking port, we're going to use some strut connectors here. We're going to go down onto the fairing, make sure we're on 4-way symmetry. 1, 2, 3, 4. That all looks great. That should hold that nice and steady. And then what we can also do, if we right click on this one docking port, we can enable the port staging, and now that docking port is now in our staging diagram. I can separate that. In fact, it'll end up going on at the same time as all those engines will. Let's get the fairing down to here. Fix our staging as you go is always a good plan. So now, instead of having to right click on this docking port, I can just hit the space bar. This will detach, and the engines on the sky crane will come on at the same time. But this thing still hasn't gotten itself to Minmus orbit. I need to put on fuel and engines onto this stage, and for that we're going to need to look back at our budget. And we can see here that the transfer out to Minmus is 930 meters per second, and then we're going to need to get a capture, and that's a further 150, and if you add those two together, that's 1080 meters per second. But I'm going to add on about another 1,000 meters per second more to that, so that the stage that we're going to create can do both the transfer out to Minmus and the final part of our orbital insertion. It's nice to combine stages this way. That's one less stage, one less engine, and then less mass for your booster to have to lift. So that gives me a budget of around 2,100 meters per second for this stage, and what I ended up using were 3 Rockomax X200-8 tanks with a Poodle engine underneath. And in fact, this gave me so much Delta V that I ended up taking out some of the fuel out of one of those Rockomax, cut it down to 216 units of liquid fuel, and then the matching amount of oxidizer. And if we take a look over here at our staging diagram, we can see this gives us 2,424 meters per second of vacuum delta V with a thrust to weight ratio of 1.24. Now be a little bit careful because the fairing will be deployed part way through the use of this stage. And if we move where this very heavy fairing is staged, we can see that actually our delta V drops to 2,166 with a thrust to weight of 1.15. Either way, well above what I need to get the job done. So that just leaves the lower stage of this rocket, and I'm going to continue to budget 3,800 meters per second for a very generous Delta V budget to get into low Kerbal orbit. And if you add that on to the numbers I've got so far, that gets me a total of 5,150 meters per second for this entire mission. And that was accomplished by just adding on 3 Rockomax X200-32 tanks with a mainsail engine on the bottom. And with the addition of 4 AV-T1 winglets and tweaking down the thrust limiter on that mainsail to a surface TWR of 1.33, this thing was ready to go. Each probe body, command capsule, and docking port is a potential control point, and this vessel has multiple control points pointing in different directions. When you have a vessel like this, it's always a good idea to take a quick glance at the nav ball before launching, and make sure it is pointing up, That is, it's all blue. If that isn't the situation, right-click on a control point that is pointing up and select Control from here. With that check out of the way, let's launch. As you've likely noticed, I've got no kerbals aboard. That's a personal choice on my part. There is certainly nothing to stop you from crewing this at launch. For immersive purposes only, I prefer to launch crew in vessels capable of safely aborting back to the surface. As for the orbital insertion, I'm following the exact same process to get to Minmus as I did in the last episode, making sure to launch at an appropriate window so that my parking orbit about Kerbin matches the plane of Minmus's orbit. This makes the injection burn out to Minmus easier to plot. If you want more detail on how to do this, you can check out that episode. In the meantime, I'm going to take this opportunity to welcome aboard my most recent Patreon patrons, Brian Lamb, Jesse Harris, and Les. Thank you very much for your support and, of course, for the ongoing support of all of my Patreon patrons and YouTube members. You will see their names in the end credits of this video, and if you would like to also join this group in supporting this channel, the links are in the down below. Last episode, I flew by Minmus in a retrograde direction to facilitate my return to Kerbin. That is, my path was in the opposite direction of Minmus's rotation. This time, I will be inserting prograde in the same direction as Minmus's rotation, as this slightly reduces the cost of the landing. Tiny differences in the Minmus injection burn make a big difference out at Minmus. Turning down the thrust limiter on the engine towards the end of the burn makes fine corrections easier. If you overcook it, just flip around retrograde and burn in the opposite direction. The injection burn in my game is directly getting me an encounter that I'm happy with. You may require a mid-course correction in your game. That isn't a problem, but I'm not going to perform a mid-course correction here. Not even to lower the inclination. An inclined orbit about Minmus will give me more options for my landing site. Small corrections in your trajectory can be made once in Minmus's sphere of influence. Here, I want my closest approach to be just a little bit lower, around 10 kilometers. I accomplish this by pointing the vessel radially inward on the nav ball while still very high in Minmus's SOI, and making a very tiny burn to adjust my path. I then capture into a low orbit about Minmus in much the same way as I did in my 3 trips to the moon. After which, it was time to pick our landing site. It's always best to land on the light side, but unfortunately, if we take a look at our situation, the light side of Minmus happens to be the far side of Kerbin, and when I get to the far side here, suddenly Minmus is blocking my communication signal and I have limited probe control. I don't want to deal with that situation, so I am going to be landing on the near side of Minmus, which unfortunately is the dark side. And what I think I'll go for, because these flats are just so lovely, I think I'm going to go for this nice flat right here. A relay network around Minmus would solve this communication problem. Definitely a topic for a future video. As for the landing, the process is exactly the same as it is for the moon, except much easier. At Minmus, you have less orbital velocity to kill off, and with Minmus's much weaker gravity, the rate at which you fall to the surface is much lower. After staging the transfer vehicle, make sure to check the control point on the base. It is very likely to switch to one of the docking ports, which remember are pointing sideways. Again, to fix this, right-click on either the probe body or the cupola module and select Control from here. Once the landing is complete, simply stage one last time and throttle up to get rid of the sky crane. And with our base now safely down and awaiting its first crew, why don't I go over the main takeaways from this episode? While building the base, I spent a little bit of time talking about electricity. Don't forget to include enough batteries for your base to survive the Minmus night. I then got into how to build a simple sky crane, which is not only useful for bases, but also for rovers. Getting awkward shapes like this into orbit isn't difficult if you remember to use the translation tool in the VAB to ensure that the thrust vector from the engine will pass through the center of mass of the payload. Finally, I looked at how to manage multiple control points on a vessel, either by using the reroute tool in the VAB or the parts context menu in flight. And with that, I'm going to be drawing this episode to a close. I hope you found it useful and that I'll be seeing you again for the next one.